Alright, g'day everyone and welcome to a long overdue guide to the Dominions 5 nation of Ubar. I'm still in sort of a post-COVID phase at the moment, so I'm going to try and keep this guide relatively short. We've already done an introduction to early age Ubar, so we'll do a sweep through the lore, the units, the commanders, we'll look at some of the national spells and units, and I'm going to give some ideas on how to use this nation effectively. Spoiler alert up front, I really like the nation of Ubar. I like what it allows you to do, I like what it encourages you to do. So I've actually been looking forward to doing this guide for a while, but I do think there's a number of factors that makes this nation perhaps a tad complicated. So let's open with the lore. Middle Age Ubar is the successor to Early Age Ubar, but as we flagged in the Early Age Ubar video, over time the magic of the Jinn, so the Ifrit Sultans and the ruling class of genies essentially, who once ruled in this grand city of brass, that magic has largely faded. And I suppose the demographic makeup of what was Ubar has changed. The city is gone. Instead, it's now a queendom carved out in the middle of a desert. Because what has happened is it's a combination of humans who are at the absolute bottom of the social totem pole, as seems to be the case in many nations in Dominions 5 in the Middle Age. By the Late Age, the humans are pretty much on top almost everywhere. And then you have an alliance in terms of the ruling class. The last remaining Jinn, not the Ifrit Sultans, but the last remaining Jinn, so one level down, interacted with Avim from Hinnom, who basically fled because, let's be honest, the Rephaim are dicks. They eat Avim, they eat humans, they're just generally dickheads, and as a result, as you'd expect, there's a bunch of refugees, and because the Avim seem to do this everywhere they go, they met the female examples of the Jinn and decided that it'd be really good to shack up together, and as a result you now have a race of half Jinn, half giant, making up the ruling class of what is this nation. So that is essentially what you've got. It's a combination of Hinnomite refugees, half Jinn, half giant descendants, who you can see represented by the Jean Guard, the last remaining Jinn in a few places, and a race of humans who are at the bottom of the social totem pole, but, you know, as you'd expect, are pretty useful because humans in Dominions 5 tend to be pretty useful because they're often pretty damn good value for money. Let's look at units and commanders. So all up, you've got a relatively compact but pretty solid army when you're looking at Ubar. It's not going to win awards, but it's also no slouch in combat. Remember, as I'm talking through these units and commanders, remember that we're now in the Middle Age, and the Middle Age is an era of serious heavy hitters in the Dominions universe. Many great powerhouses find their moment in the Middle Age. So yes, a lot of Ubar's units and majors are going to come off as strong, and indeed the nation is strong, but remember that we're comparing this against the age of Nazca, of Ashdod, you've still got Pangaea, you've got a whole bunch of super powerful nations hovering here in the Middle Age. So the competition is pretty damn fierce. Okay, let's do units first. The Nubian Desert Warrior. We remember this guy, so we don't need to talk about him again. Cheap as chips, short bow, undisciplined, stealthy. You put flaming arrows on him and you have a good time. Nubian Soldier. Okay, so this is a basically cheap in gold, moderately expensive in resources, cheap in rec point, basic bitch light infantryman with 13 protection and average stats, and a scimitar, no throwing weapon, does hit moderately hard for what he does. The problem is, if you're going to want infantry that hit hard, you've got giant options, you're probably going to go with them instead. Nubian light infantry has a little bit less protection, same sort of cost profile in terms of gold and rec points, but fewer resources. You gain the javelin, which means if you're going down the flaming missiles route, they're available to you. Camel riders, like the Desert Warriors, are still available as foreign recruits, and they're still useful. They're still expensive at 22 gold for a unit, but I tested a number of modes of expansion in this game and some other trial games, and camel riders still work as an expanding force against a lot of opponents. They're still very mobile, they're still stealthy, they're still useful. They last longer than you expect, I think, primarily because that defense skill of 14 is okay. They do tend to distract their opponent with their birds, which gives them time to get more arrows in. And when they do hit their targets, which they do at attack skill 12, so it's not terrible, they hit pretty hard at 17. The main problem is still their expense. At 22 gold, your economy is going to hurt if you try and sustain large numbers of camel riders, but they can be useful. And then you have the Adite troops. So these are the descendants of the Arvim who fled from Hinnom. And rather, I think the Adites are the tribe of Arvim who fled from Hinnom. Anyway, so what you have here is a size 3 Avite giant chassis, and that has all that you've come to expect from the nations of like Ashdod and Hinnom. This one's actually, these are all reasonably good examples. This first guy here, 25 gold gets you a great bow. The expense here is really in the resources. 37 resources is bloody steep, but what you get for this is, despite abysmal melee stats, you get 18 protection and a 16 damage, range 50 bow. And if it does get into close combat, you do have an attack skill 10, 20 damage, pierce, or slash attack. It's okay. The problem is if you're going to be using flaming arrows, you'd rather have lots more arrows in the air than some very, very expensive ones. But, you know, all of these Adite troops you'll see, particularly the elite soldiers and the archers, are mechanisms by which you can eat up a lot of resources in your forts if you want to. The Adite light infantrymen, considerably cheaper in terms of resources, much lower in terms of protection, but better stats, and this one's got a 17 damage javelin that it throws on its way in. I like high damage javelins. Javelins tend to hit more often than you think because they're thrown from close range. 17 damage is a lot. Like 17 pierce will go through a lot of things and you know, cause the other side to feel the hurt. So the Adite light infantryman is okay. The Adite elite soldier is pretty good. 23 damage, 12 magic resistance, 13 morale, attack 12, defense 14. For 30 gold, 26 rec points, 26 resources, 19 rec points. This is relatively balanced. I mean, map move 12 is pretty slow. Encumbrance 6 is okay. But at 25 hit points, size 3, 15 prot, this is a pretty decent unit all up, and 23 damage at attack value 13. If you're fighting things that aren't like sacreds, you're going to hit them, you're going to hurt them. The problem I have is a lot of things that you're going to be fighting from other players, not from the environment. These things will trash indies perfectly fine. A lot of the things you're going to be fighting in the Middle Age are going to be blessed sacreds, so the Adite elite soldiers, not really up to it. The Yarn Guard, okay. The Yarn Guard, or Jan Guard, however you want to say that. So these are the half-breeds. These are part Avim, part Jinn. And as a result, they have some of the features of Giants and some of the features of Jinn, but not all of either. For example, they are still iron vulnerable, but they are not salt vulnerable. They are glamoured, but they are not unseen. So they aren't a unit which is super polarising in the way that Ubar's sacreds were. Your opponents are not forced to bring Spirit Sight because these guys don't have unseen. They don't have that 10 nerf to the opponent's attack if they haven't hit you in melee first. And they don't pay for that, which is a really good thing. They wear protection at 13. At 13 attack, 15 defense, and scimitar's a good weapon, so basic attack skill of 14. They're a solid all-around glamoured infantryman that happens to have the bodyguard trait and happens to be resistant to fire. 22 hit points for 40 gold doesn't seem like a great deal, but then you remember these guys are sacred. So while this is not an oppressive sacred that carries a bless, as a general trooper, I actually quite like it. It's cheaper to maintain than an Adite elite soldier. It's probably going to be much better as a result of glamour and whatever bless you happen to put on it. Even if your bless is keyed for your mages or whatnot, the Jan Guard are still going to benefit from it. Because they're blessable, they're one of the mechanisms that you can do to bring out things like magic weapons if you want them in your bless, for example. If you have fire or blood or a rainbow bless, which is one of the things I think can work really, really well for this nation in terms of giving you access to your various summons and to diversity later on, they're going to benefit from that, right? Like if you have an imprisoned rainbow with a bunch of low-level paths, these guys are going to pick up resistances and stat blesses all over the place. So they're not white centaurs, they're not Vanheers, they're not Vans, they're not any of the oppressive sacreds that we know and love, but they're solid, and because they're sacred, they're relatively cheap to maintain. I don't have a problem with them. I think this is a perfectly serviceable capital-only sacred. Then you got your commanders. The Nebian Scout is a foreign recruit scout, which means All provinces for Nabar are scout provinces, all of them. So if you don't have map awareness, that's on you. I'm sorry, the developers cannot make it any easier for you. You're paying 20 gold for a 50 stealth value, completely disposable scout, and you're doing it in any basic province that doesn't have a fort in it, or that does have a fort in it. It doesn't matter. You have infinite scouts. Your scouts are cheap. Buy them, see what's happening. And at the same time, laugh because your opponents can't tell who owns provinces where your dominion sits. That hasn't changed from the early age. You also still have giant forts, but labs cost 250 in wastes. Giant forts suck. Labs costing 250 in wastes is good. We'll call it even. Then you have the Sheikh. We're familiar with the Sheikh, so we don't need to talk about them again. It's still a tax collecting, mobile, camel-based leader. 8-ite general. So now you've got a leadership 80 general, that means formations, but you're paying a lot for a basic ass leader. So, you know, I'm a bit meh on them when you could rather get more different sort of commanders. The thing is, do you need the leadership and the formations? That's a question that I leave to you. Mukhrib. Okay, now we're getting the mages. Mages are interesting. I like the Nabar mage lineup because they've got a lot of the things that I tend to look for. They do have a foreign recruit that I'll point out first, the Hermit Sahir. So this is foreign recruitable in all non-fort provinces. So, and they're not sacred, so they don't need temples. So if you want to lab, for example, a wasteland, you can turn a wasteland into a mage production province for 250 gold. That's a very, very low infrastructure investment. And considering that you're also a nation that might blood hunt, you're probably going to have labs sitting in extra provinces. As Nabar, those labs can be used to produce mages. Now, that mage is not particularly inspiring. He's got his little Hin companion, but he's got Fire, Air, Earth, 1/1/1, and then random magic, Fire, Air, Earth, or Astral. Now, a lot of that's pretty useful. Sure, he's not sacred, which means he's got a reasonable upkeep cost, 100 per year. But Fire 2 is useful. That's a Fire 3 in combat. Air 2 is useful, especially if you're going to have storms. Earth 2 can be useful because you can Earth power up to Earth 3 and do some useful stuff. And Astral is useful too because at that point you can wire them into communions and make them whatever they want. So I think that the Hermits are here. Sure, you're not going to be pumping out 1 billion of them, but they're a decent use of excess gold coming out of your non-fort provinces. Just don't let them eat up all of your national upkeep. And as you'll notice in a moment, you've got some expensive mages as is. But I have no reason to argue with a nation that adds on the handy ability to get mages in non-fort provinces if you can avoid getting them sniped. Then you got the Mukhrib. Okay, so Mukhrib, basic bitch sacred mage, cheap as they come. Interestingly, is stealthy. So if the opponent is going to take a fort and you can't defend it, and the Mukhrib themselves aren't very good at defending forts because Earth 1's not a great path unless you've got a bunch of gems to hand out, at least for defensive purposes, they can make the tiny elementals and that's about it. You can stealth them out. You can flee, and it's hard to intercept them. It's hard to drop on them and surround them. You can escape, essentially, as long as you've got a little bit of warning. The Mukhrib functions as the bargain basement research option. So in Magic 3, this guy's going to run 10 research per turn for an upkeep of 32 gold per year. The problem, or the counter rather, is that the Mukhrib isn't really useful for much else. It's a priest 1. It doubles up as your priest 1, I suppose. So it's also going to be doing your preaching. Then you've got the Mukhrib. Mukhrib is big Mukhrib. Mukhrib costs 40 extra gold, and you switch to being Astral instead of Earth 1. Now, Astral 1 is a lot more bloody useful than Earth 1. This is your Communion Slave. It's a Communion Slave with 21 hit points and Sacred. There's things you can do there. It's also Fortune Teller. It's not a fantastic researcher. It's not an efficient researcher because it's 120 gold for 7 research. You're paying for this Priest level 2, which I'm not a fan of. That said, this is the age of middle-aged Ermor. This is the era of Asphodel. There's some undead shenanigans going on in the Middle Age, so maybe having a bunch of Priest 2s as your Communion Slaves who can communion to be giant priests and throw hella banishment, that's a handy thing to have in the Middle Age. So don't sleep on the Mukhrib. Also, functional leader with Priest 2 can lead expansion parties of Sacreds just fine. Had perfect success using these guys to lead expansion parties, and you're not going to regret having them later because Astral 1. Janome, okay. The Janome, what is there to say about the Janome? It's a function. This is a functional light thug. For 280 gold, you get Fire 1, Air 1, Priest 1, random Fire, Air, Earth. Fire 2 is useful, Air 2 is very useful, and E1 is useful too for buffing when you're thugging. It's great to be able to make your skin stone or something in order to buff up your survivability. You're stealthy and you're glamoured, which means you're a stealthy raider. You've got really good, decent basic statistics at attack 14, defense 15. You can do a lot with that with a really basic item kit. The basic protection is okay, but you might want to replace it if you're doing heavier sort of thugging. This is a functional thug. You can do something with different versions of these magic combinations. People probably gravitate towards the Air 2s, but you can do something. The Air 2s and the Earth 1s are probably the ones that I would consider most useful. They're also fantastic leaders. Squad morale 2 and formations unlocked, obviously, that goes together. So these are fantastic army leaders as well as light thugs. And then you've got the Sahir. So the Sahir has less armor and worse stats and whatever, and the Janome is sacred, by the way. That's worth saying, which means the upkeep on these guys is lower than you'd expect. You're just paying up front. The Sahir, you lose a lot of the command ability and the armor and the fancy and the bling, and you gain just straight more magic power. So it's always Fire 2, it's always Air 2, it's always Earth 1, and then you got the same randoms all over again. But you're guaranteed to, basically you hit all of the randoms for the Janome, but you then get a random on top of that as well. So Fire 3, we know, can get you to Fire 4. Fire 4 can get you to all sorts of fun stuff. These might be your guys who, they're perfectly capable of doing big battlefield stuff, but we'll talk to the Malika in a moment. The Malika can do a lot of it better. But so here at Air 3, in Storms will be Air 4, which means they can really bring the pain. Even non-air randoms will be Air 3 in Storms, which means they can be useful. Earth 2 can be Earth 3, which means Earth Elementals and all sorts of stuff. And the Astral Random, again, means they can either be functional batteries for their relative communion paths, or they're very expensive for communion batteries, or they can boost themselves up. Their real utility relative to the Malika, who we'll talk about in a moment, or the Malika, is that they recruit everywhere, whereas the Malika is your capital-only mage. You no longer have much competition for your capital. There's only one capital-only mage now, as opposed to Ubar, which had fierce competition for its capital slots. But here they are, the Malika. So, the Malika these are the queens. They're descendants of the sultans of old Ubar. They're the closest to Jinnon you have in your recruitable roster as opposed to your summonable roster. So, you get Fire 3, Air 3, Earth 1, Sacred, and Priest right out of the box. So, you can Phoenix Power to Fire 4. You can Storm Power to Air 4. The Air randoms, the random here being Fire, Air, Earth, Astral, Nature. So this is the first we've seen of Nature. And even Nature 1 is a little bit useful to have a sprinkling of in a roster in order to make some useful... it's just useful to have Air 1, Nature 1 rather, especially on a mage. Like this one that's a little bit survivable and that you want to have a couple of, so you won't cry when you get that Nature 1. To be honest though, if you're doing stuff with Nature 1, you'd rather be doing it with indies in the first place. So these are your Storm casters in the case of them. These are your Stave Elemental Mastery casters if you get the right kit to boost them as well. So this is a really strong set of magical abilities coupled with shock resistance, fire resistance, which makes this survivable along with 19 hit points. It's ethereal, unlike your other guys. It's stealthy. It has glamour. Obfuscate is interesting. This essentially reduces the perceived size of the army that is led by the Malika. So you can reduce the size of the army. That said, a lot of the time a Malika's army, you'd imagine, will also be stealthy entirely. So Obfuscate won't matter there. It will matter if you're leading humans or Adites. Then you've got Iron Vulnerability, Salt Vulnerability, because it's still a Djinn, and Magic Power 1. People have said that this unit can be thugged. I believe them when they say it can be thugged because there's a lot of magic here. My only comment to that is you're going to have to be really effective and efficient with it because that's a lot of gold and rec points to be putting into something that if you lose And you can lose. Like, if things go wrong, it doesn't have much defense and it has very few hit points relative to its gold value. You're putting a lot on the line. But what do we see if we look at this lineup basically? That we've got some researchers and some communion batteries, which Ubar didn't have. Ubar didn't have astral communion batteries. Ubar had blood communion batteries, which you still have. We'll talk about in a moment. But recruitable astral 1, coupled with big elemental magic. Fire, air, earth. That's where we're at. Fire, air, earth. And fire, air, earth on a nation that can boost with communion. So we are a Wrathful Skies nation. We are a Flaming Arrows nation. We are a Smokeless Flame nation, because you still have that. We can do evos, we can do enchantments, we can do elemental conjurations. If it's elemental, they can do it. What you're lacking is big late game sorcery potential, at least on the stuff that you can recruit. You don't have death, you don't have big astral, and you don't have blood on your recruitables, which leaves you in an apparently difficult position, because what you've got here is a functional army for the early game. You've got a mage core that can fight in the middle game, because I think elemental magic is shit on too much. Elemental magic and dominions in the middle age can punch real hard, especially when you've got some unique spells and high levels of access, and Ubar has both of them. It can do the big battlefield wipes, it can do the point targeting spells, it can do the buffs, it can do the enchants, and it can do it all using mages that don't have human HP and don't die too easy, which is always great. Malikas may not have any protection, but at least they've got a little bit more of a hit point buffer and a couple of innate resistances that help keep them alive, especially when you throw on Sacred. So they're already shock and fire resistant. If you also make them poison resistant, cold resistant, it starts to get pretty damn hard to wipe these things using things that have any resistance associated with them, for example. So that's a good thing there. We're going to jump over to the Mod Inspector, though, because the second part of Nabar, just like Ubar, a lot of it comes in what you can summon, the unique national summons, and what that lets you unleash. And that also goes to what I think about God design and God access, because one of the decisions you've got to make as Nabar, and I have my opinion on it, is whether or not you want to go Blood Nabar. You want to try and break into blood and do that side of things as well, or whether you're happy just being elemental Nabar. So let's go have a look at Mod Inspector. Okay, so here we are in Dom 5 Mod Inspector. I'm going to sweep through the spells that aren't particularly important or that we've covered a million times before. Like, you don't need to know again about Great Lions. We've talked about Great Lions, and the fact is you don't really even have Easy Nature 2 available to you. So we don't need to really talk about those sort of things. Let's talk about the others. Let's talk about Contact Jinn, Jinn Warriors, Huri. The theme that you're going to see emerge pretty quickly is that a lot of the units that you've lost access to from Ubar are now available as summons, which is why there are so many bloody summons available to Nabar. Keep going. Smokeless Flames over here, Scorching Winds over here. These are your evocations. Awakened Jinn Block is down here, but that's in Thalm. Feast for Gulls. Okay, we're going to put blood in the middle because that matters. Bin we'll put with summons, and Silat we'll put with summons. Okay, let's do your evocations first. Smokeless Flame is still around, and it's awesome. You have mages that can cast this out of the box. Your 3/1s, your 3/3s can cast this straight away. So you're going to have a lot of casters that can throw Smokeless Flame if you get to Evocation 6. Evocation 6 also gets in the territory of starting to talk about battlefield wipes, being very close to some battlefield wipes, some AoE, some great utility evos. So everything I said about Evocation being functional on Ubar is absolutely applicable to Nabar because this spell slays. 45 damage, 45 armor piercing damage is fantastic. It's only AoE 1 and it's not precision 100, but oof, it punches extremely hard for a spell that only has a fatigue cost of 30. And then you've also got the Immolate effect on top of it, which doubles down on the slaughtering effect. And it adds lingering heat to an area, which is basically a cloud effect, as I understand it. Cloud ongoing heat procs, which is basically fatigue. Lots of fatigue constantly hitting the people who walk through. So basically you're deleting squares from your opponent's army, just going pop, 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 and everyone who walks through that squares is getting heat effects on them as well. Scorching Wind is the much lower level one. This is A2 Fire 1, but again, we've seen our mages tend to have paths across all of them, so you're going to have casters. Scorching Wind has a much larger AoE. The difference here is it's not a lethal spell, it's a fatigue spell. So afflicted units get 2d8 fatigue damage each turn, magic resistance plus DRN versus 22 to negate. So this is about inflicting fatigue over large areas. You're probably not going to dwell on it too much because it's better to just kill things most of the time, but remember that this spell is here and it's super easy for you to access. But Smokeless Flame, great spell at Evo 6. Blood we're going to leave to last because it's a decision. Let's talk about our elemental summons. I'm going to leave the blood summons off to the side because they're linked to the discussion about blood. So let's talk all these elemental summons. So what have we got in order? Conjuration 4. You've got Summon Jinn at Conj 4. So you can use a Fire 2, Air 1, and 18 Fire Gems to get Jinn. And Jinn are exactly what they were in the early age in terms of chassis. And this one's a Fire 2, Air 2, 13 Research. So it's stealthy, it's iron vulnerable, and whatnot. It's everything you expect a Jinn to be. You're spending 18 Fire Gems to get this. I don't think this is a huge thing, because those are paths that you have available anyway, but you can cast this summon if you want it in order to get a couple of Jinn, and you can pretend that it's old Ubar, just like it used to be. And Conjuration 4 is pretty early. 18 Fire Gems is not a particularly steep price, but that's not also not a particularly inspiring commander summon. But it is still a commander summon. Uri, okay, so these are the fair ones. So we remember Uri, they used to be recruitable. So here you need Air 2, Nature 1, which is where your Nature 1 random Malikas come in. This is how you get Nature 2. So you spend 26 Air Gems, and you get a Fire 2, Air 2, Nature 2, Jinn chassis, so it gets stealthy, magic power, etc. That also has Seduction. So it's an interesting one. Conjuration 6. This is a perfectly functional Seduction Assassin. Reasonably expensive for what it is at 26 gems, but a couple of them might get you results. If you're not going down the route which allows you to get Shaitan, which is what typically discounted the Huri previously, then this is there. Also, it's an option to get you access to a Nature 2 if you really want a Nature 2 for Air Gems. Jinn Warriors lets you summon Sacreds for gems, which is usually something that's worth looking at if you go down that route. I don't think this is a particularly inspiring one, but 6 Jinn Warriors for 18 Fire Gems. Question, do you want the Jinn Commander, the Fire 2, Air 2, or do you want 3 Sacred Jinn with Prot 10, 12 attack, 14 defense, nice high damage, Enchanted Scimitar, so built-in magical weapon that has stealthy, magic power, the things that you're used to. Again, whether you want the Commander, this one, or neither, just remember that it's there. You do need to go to Conjuration 5. Conjuration 5, of course, being a really common breakpoint because people want large elementals. Well, you go there, you happen to pick up the Jinn spell along the way. Marids, you're going all the way to Conjuration 8 to get. This is your big underwater Ifrit Sultan. It's Fire 4, Air 2, which you absolutely have. I like these guys serve a similar role of like Kings of Elemental Fire. They're big, scary, high path casters with lots of resistances and abilities. The main problem is obviously the Marid has that salt vulnerability that Ifrit Sultan suffered from back in early age Ubar. But people might not be as ready for them this time as round. Like people aren't going to be cranking the salt because you're not cranking out salt vulnerable units and commanders until later in the game. So you might catch some people off guard. It can go underwater really, really easily, and it can really mess shit up underwater. It flies in storms, and it's ethereal, which means it can fly underwater, which is always fun. If there's a Nazca in the game and he's using his Sapphires to fly underwater, send your Marid in and say, look, dude, I can do that too. So solid unit, 66 Fire Gems, absolutely worth it, but you have to go all the way to Conjuration 8 to get it. But if you do go to Conjuration 8, you will have a Fire 4, Air 2 floating around in order to cast it. It'll be one of your capital-only mages. Awakened Jinn block. So this is a Thaumaturgy one, which means it stands out as being a bit odd. And it is frankly a bit odd. It's a rock. You spend 5 Earth Gems, so it's really cheap on your Earth one, Priest one, which is your cheap ass research mage, and they can make blocks. The blocks are immobile. The blocks are rocks, so they're slash resistant, pierce resistant, etc. They don't need to eat, yay. The problem is they have inept researcher -8 and Mastersmith -1, so they can't research, they can't be smiths, they exist, but they do have innate spellcaster, which means they put out a lot of F1A1 spam. I haven't experimented with the Djinn block, but I can imagine that if you summoned a bunch of these, it could be a little bit trollish if they had something to do with their F1 A1. You might want to do some sort of trolling where if you dumped 10 or 20 of them into a fortress and you gave them all 1 fire gem and they all fired off Pillar of Fire and they had innate spellcaster, so they were doing 2 a turn, like, I don't know. I don't know what you can do with this. It's a rock. You can summon rocks. They're cheap. They can't go anywhere. They can't do anything. I'm going to stay away from it most of the time because the mage can't even research. All it can do is defend its location, essentially. Cool. Also, it's sacred, so it's likely to have a whole bunch of resistances. And it has basic resistance to fire and poison. So if you have more of that, it's just going to be more of the same. The Silat. Okay, Silat, Conjuration 6, so we're getting a little bit higher now. We use air magic to summon this. We get fire, air, earth. This doesn't excite me. Now, yes, it does fly, and it does have seduction, so this is another seducer that would probably use air magic, so probably maybe give it 2 air gems and have it make air elementals if you want to turn this into an assassin for 21 air gems plus kit plus 2 air gems per assassination. That might work. But I'm not excited by it because these are paths we have already. We have so much fire and we have so much air and we have so much earth that I'm sorry, but I probably don't want to spend 21 air gems on another one of these. I would probably rather make 21 large air elementals in a really important fight and kill an army. That's probably going to give me better value for money. So unfortunately, I'm going to put the Salat in the probably not column. 2 more at Conjuration 6. We are almost there. Summon Hin. You remember the Hin? These are the animal sacreds. I wasn't a huge fan of them before. I'm still not a huge fan of them, but you get a lot of them. A lot of them. And I'm sorry, they're not sacred. They're just whatchamacallit, ethereal. Ethereal. I was thinking ethereal. I said sacred. I mean ethereal. I don't like them personally. I think they'll shoot through your air gems quickly. And I'm going to judge them because they exist in the era that Condors do, and Condors cost air gems, and Condors are better in every way. I mean, admittedly, Nazgûl is bloody strong, but, you know, there it is. And then you've got Bin. Bin are also at Conjuration 6. Bin want you to spend your water gems using Water 1, Air 1, which is not something you're going to have a lot of. And what do they give you? Well, I'm not excited by the Bin at all. So I wasn't excited before. I'm still not excited. Let's talk blood, because blood is an interesting choice. So you only have to go to blood 5 to break into a blood economy. This is the completely optional blood economy of Nabar. And as we all know, it's commonly held, and I personally hold the view that death, blood, and to a lesser extent, I actually think it's to a lesser extent, but actually no, you know what? I'll retract that. To an almost equal extent, High Astral is also a late game option because for some nations, like Wish Farming and Arcane Nexus are absolutely end game plans that sit up there alongside Immortal Spam and the Blood Economy. Blood Economy is probably the strongest of the 3 options. At Blood 4, you get Feast for Gulls. That gives you Gulls. I've talked about them before. I kind of like them. They need buffs. Their main thing is this insane regeneration. But the interesting thing about Gulls is not the Gulls, it's the Gullah. So, it's a Blood 1 ritual for 31 Blood Slaves, which makes the Gullah cheap. 31 slaves is not a lot. And Gullahs are Blood Searcher +1s. So for 31 Blood Slaves at Blood 5, you get a blood hunter level, a level 2 blood hunter that also has some ability to survive because it's got regen 50, it's got 13 hit points. It has built-in resist fire, resist poison. Resist fire I do like to an extent because things like flames from the sky later in the game aren't going to nuke entire communions of these. They're extremely good communion slaves because they've got that 50% base regeneration while also being cheap. They're great blood hunters. The Gullah is something you can build a blood economy on. It just takes you going to Blood Research 5 and then being committed. So you probably need something to start the train rolling, and that's probably going to be, in fact, no, I'll take it back. It's almost certainly going to be your Pretender, because gambling on hero spawns is not really something that you should do. So if you decide to build a blood economy, this is how you're going to do it. You're going to take a Pretender, which probably has blood 4. It's probably going to be a blood surge command Pretender. It's going to wake up from dormant or maybe even imprisoned, depending on how long you want to wait for your blood economy. It's going to hunt up some blood slaves. It's going to make Gullahs. Gullahs are going to make more Gullahs, which will make more Gullahs, which will make more Gullahs, which will make a whole lot of Gullahs. Like, I don't think you can understand how many of these that you want to make. And then you have a blood economy. And that blood economy can be used in ways that don't require you to go all the way to blood 7 to get vampire lords, because the typical way is you build a blood economy, and if you don't have a national summon, you spam vampires. Well, you spam Gullahs in order to get your blood economy going. They're not immortal, which means you got to defend your blood hunting provinces, but like, you know, cope. Blood 5 gives you Ifrits. That's right. Like, do you remember Ifrits? This is a Fire 3, Air 2, Size 4, 36 hit point, good stats, but this has got magic power, fire shield, and a good fire shield. A heat aura, resistance to shock, doesn't resist cold. Maybe that's in your bless, maybe you don't care. 65 fire resist. This thing can catch some people off guard if they're not keyed to it. In particular, the built-in fire shield effect on a high fire. Also, for 58 blood slaves, this is not that expensive. It's a nice throwback, I suppose. This is probably, I would argue that this is cheaper than you used to pay in terms of gold once you have a blood economy going, but it might be painful early on. But the real deal is that we can now make Shaitan for blood. And at blood 1, fire 3, the question now becomes access. You can do this with the same Pretender, probably, who broke you into Gullahs, if you go that way. I don't want to say you have to go Blood as Nabar, but I'm basically saying what you do if you do. You break in, you get a Shaitan, then you find a Shaitan, a fire booster, and it makes more Shaitan. And the Shaitan itself remains bloody brilliant. It remains awesome. It's still a Fire 2, Air 2, Blood 2 Corruptor. Which is the way that you acquire magic diversity on a larger scale. Either summoning it with your commander, with your Pretender rather, or you go and act like early age Ubar and you steal everyone's shit. The Shaitan is still very good at that. Now, 73 blood slaves seems like a lot, but I would argue it's really worth it for this commander. Blood 6 is one level lower than Blood 7, and it's easier to access. You don't need quite the same paths on your god that you would if you were going Vampire Lords, although we can still talk about Vampire Lords as a later game option. They're not immortal, but they are stealthy and they are Corruptors, which is a really strong form of Seducer. They're extremely mobile. They're magical spies, which is kind of cool. And they're unseen. A spy that is unseen is fantastic. So I continue to love the Shaitan. I love them in the early age. I still love them. So if you do get a blood economy rolling, getting to the point where you've produced one of these and that one produces another one, and those two, depending on how quickly your economy scales. If you have a reasonably sized blood economy, if you're doing 300 slaves a turn, you might do 4 Shaitan in a turn. And that's the thing here. Shifting it from being a gold recruit to a blood slave recruit, you can say, yeah, okay, maybe gold's easier to come by, sure, but there's a limit to how quickly you can recruit. There isn't a limit to how quickly you can recruit other than your economic potential when you talk about Shaitan being summoned for blood. Then we have our heroes. Let's talk about our heroes. we'll just talk, we have one basic one, and then we'll load worthy heroes, and then jump back into the game, and I'll give my observations on the nation. You got your multi-hero, which is the same as in the early age. So Banu Silat, these are the children, they're humans who married Silat. It's a multi-hero, it's not particularly fancy. They fly, but they're not fast. They command okay, they have fire, air, and they have random. Like, they're handy when you get them, but you're not going to cheer. Like, you have so much fire, air. And this is just more fire, air. Your Queen of Nabar, your unique hero, is unfortunately more fire, air, and earth. I mean, I'm sorry. This is even easier access to Staves of Elemental Mastery, and it's a lot of earth magic, but yeah, look, she's handy, and she's got minimum turn arrival 10, so she can land early, and army size minus 50% is kind of funny, but you know, I'm not going to deliberately load luck 3 in order to get her, basically. And let's have a look at, nope, she doesn't change. Banu Silat doesn't change. And we gain the Sword Bearer. I know we gained the Sword Bearer because when I was doing my test games, I got him on like turn 2 because he does not have a minimum arrival. He casts Personal Luck each time. Sacred, Glamour, Fire 2, Air 3, Blood 3. So, this worthy hero guy can summon Shaden. So if you're playing a Worthy Heroes game and you insist on not relying on your god, or you just can't find the fire paths for your god in order to do it, because you probably still need blood, you can go luck 3 and hope you get your Sword Bearer, because you'll be rolling a reasonable percentage chance every turn from the start of the game. Hell, you can even go luck 3 and try and rely on him to start your blood economy. If you get him early, he might be able to start blood hunting from like turn 4. Which is how you're going to build up a decent basis of slaves to start rolling later on. He can also, of course, summon Gullah, because they are just blood 1. So I think if you're not playing Worthy Heroes, then it doesn't really matter at all. You've got some Fortune Tellers, so I wouldn't bother with luck. If you're playing Worthy Heroes, you can build it into your Pretender, or you can gamble, or both. And if you do gamble, you need to take some luck and hope that you get the Sword Bearer. Sword Bearer gets you your Gullahs, and later on gets you your Shaden. But, you know, that really is rolling the dice. It's decent percentages at luck 3, rolling from turn 1, but, you know, it is what it is. Let's jump back into the game. So where does that leave Nabar strategically as an experience for the player and as a set of tools that you can use? I think the answer is, to jump to the end for a moment, a really good place. I think Nabar provides an above average set of tools, but that's in the context of existing in an era where many of the most powerful nations in Dominions exist. Here is where the fact that most of my experience in Dominions comes from larger multiplayer games comes in, because it's going to affect the way I would play Nabar if indeed I get to take them out into a large-scale multiplayer game. I think Nabar's early game is fine. I think its expansion is fine. You have heaps of tools that enable you to do it. You can do Camel expansion, you can do Elite expansion, you can do 8-eyed expansion. I've tested all of them. They all work. This was a 30-something province expand in the test game, and I think I lost one expansion party when it ran into elemental summoners that I had detected, and in this I tried to lance out and practice encircling territory. So it actually represents a very, very large expansion footprint. So the expansion's not a problem. As you transition into the middle game, you've got a choice of a lot of tools that you can choose to embrace, as well as that army that you start with, which is a combination of, you know, an okay sacred that is relatively cost effective, that'll carry a bless reasonably well and back up a reasonable number of good line troops. What you have to choose in the mid game is where you're going to go with your elemental power. You are a major elemental nation, and of all the magic types, the elemental schools, so your fire, your air, your earth, etc., they are at their best in relative terms in the middle game. In the late game, it's astral, death, blood all the way in terms of the best tools that are available. But in the middle of the game, You have evocations, you have conjurations, you have enchantments, you have all sorts of spells that are available to these casters. You can be a Wrathful Skies nation. You can go straight for Smokeless Flame and start deleting sacreds, because I don't care if they have 15 fire resistance. 45 fire damage to the face is going to nuke squares of them at a time, and you have lots of casters of that sort of magic. You can do heaps of elementals. You can do air evocations alongside your fire evocations. You can do some flaming arrows. There's a lot of options available to Ubar in the middle game. Plus, you've got Holy Communions available to you. So you've got a good number of middle game tools that are mostly scales based. Plus, you've got some recruitable thugs. So in the middle game, what I'd be looking to do as Ubar is exploiting the fact that you are in the upper middle part of the power spectrum. What do I mean by that? So if you are a complete trash tier nation, you are likely to get attacked by someone who wants to eat someone else. They're prey. Nations that are known to be really weak and unable to defend themselves early on, they're going to have trouble in those circumstances. They're likely to be attacked. At the other end of the spectrum, there's the so incredibly dangerous nations that no one thinks they should be allowed to exist. And those are the nations that are both going to have to eat someone, so they're going to have to get into an early war, and they're going to have other players out there trying to stop them, if you're in a game where people are paying attention to the board. So Celeria is the biggest example of a nation that goes nuclear, but Nazca can absolutely go nuclear, just not quite as quickly as Celeria. But I'd argue that Nazca, once Nazca's fully nuclear, is actually a more diverse and dangerous force than Celeria is in many ways. You've got other powers, you've got major blood powers that can go nuclear as well, all of which are going to be, and some of those nuclear powers, if you look at Asia Bulba, are also the ones people are going to want to rush down. So you've got a situation where people are going to want to kill the top dogs, and the top dogs are going to have to go into war. So what you're positioned as Ubar is to make sure you're part of the coalitions that develop to try and knock out the top contenders. You've got to knock out some of the top contenders early if you're going to have the best possible chance. Plus, this buys you time. Buys you time to unlock and get established whatever your own late game will be. So you want to be part of a multi-party coalition, whether that's joining on the side of a defender or being proactive and joining up with a number of other nations to go crush a top contender. Works well either way. You have a lot of tools, for example, that would enable you to fight Celeria relatively well. You've got Flaming Arrows, you've got Holy Communions. That's a really good place to start in terms of wiping the sort of numbers of skeletons that they're likely to have early on. You can make a valuable contribution to that sort of effort. And you have tools that are available against a lot of the other dangerous nations as well. Ermor is very much like Celeria in terms of what it takes to counter them. The options are there. Then you need to decide, and I think you need to decide this before the game starts, what is your late game plan going to be? Not necessarily what your research paths are going to be, but what is your late game plan going to be? I think you've got a couple of options here, and you can mix and match and take multiples, because at the end of the day, unfortunately, this powerful elemental magic is not going to take you all the way through to the end. Eventually, people are going to be resistant to all of it, and you're going to be outscaled by people who have access to the big late game tools, who can go for Arcane Nexus, who can go into a blood economy, who can break into the Death Immortals. So I think either you're taking a Imprisoned Rainbow or some form of rainbow, or a Titan, just something that has late game magic paths on it that enables you to break into, say, for example, Big Death or Big Astral, or at least break into other pools of magic beyond just the ones you have available to you, or you're deciding that you're going to be Blood Ubar. Blood Ubar is a very legitimate option, but unless you're going to rely on hitting your heroes perfectly, your worthy heroes perfectly. In fact, even then, I'd scrap that. I would say you should rely on your pretender if you're going to go Blood Ubar. So you need a pretender who can do blood hunting, who can then get you up to blood 5. You're going to have you want to have a reasonable number of blood slaves ready, and then at blood 5 you want to start pumping gullers, and gullers are going to get you into your wider blood economy, and you're going to want your god to have the ability to give you the fire blood cross path, so you can go into Shaitan. And that's how you make a really good blood economy. You can go all the way to 7, and if you've thrown in death as well, you can start doing vampire lords, but your blood economy is going to be built on these blood 2 hunting gullers that you can get out relatively quickly. The problem with this is the timing of the transition really matters. You're going to feel it when you go blood 5 because you don't have a whole bunch of casters early on. So you're not going to get huge utility out of it other than slowly getting this economy. Hitting level 5 or level 6 in just about any other school, you're going to really feel a boost in power. Hitting Conjuration 5 is going to really give you power. You'll suddenly have the ability to throw large elementals. And large elementals in large numbers, which is something you can totally do. Those are basically tools that allow you to pick 1, 2 critical battles, and in exchange for throwing a lot of gems at it, usually win. Large spam of size 6 elementals is usually enough to win a lot of battles against a lot of things. Like size 6 air elementals are devastating against a whole bunch of stuff. Blood 5, not really. It just unlocks your ability to go late game. And you're going to be weighing that against, say, well, if I instead go construction 6, I get lanterns and I can compete in the research game. So the timing of the transition into blood, if you go that way, is important, it's significant, but it does allow you access to a whole bunch of late game tools. Because that blood economy, once it gets going, even though you don't have recruitable blood mages, which is the sign of a really good blood economy, you've got cheaply summonable blood hunters. So the blood hunters who can make more blood hunters, plus you've got some good unique summons. Things like Shaitan, for example, just like they did for early age Ubar, are a tool that enable you to widen your diversity, and they add another bit of threat to your arsenal. And the other thing I'll say is, obviously, in terms of getting your elemental magic useful and devastating in the late game, communions are where it's at, and gullers are just fantastic. Communion size, because of that 50% regeneration, you can make that 60% regeneration. You can do some incredibly cost-effective turbo communions with Nabar that also happen to be resistant to a whole bunch of remote attack spells in a way that human HP ordinary communions aren't. So there's a lot of options there. There are other ways to play this nation. I accept that. You could hypothetically do a Bless Nabar. You can really focus on, people have gone so far as to say you could, with the right Bless and scripting, you can do Malika expansion. You can try and channel more of that giant and elfy side of the nation than what I see here, which is the hybrid economic potential of the nation. But I think in the context of the Middle Age, where you're sort of nestled between the dangerous powers that are both trying to kill everyone and that everyone wants dead, and the obvious food nations, because there are some trash tier nations in the Middle Age, Nabar's sat nicely in the middle, and if you can convince people to ignore you and cooperate with you in the name of destroying those more dangerous actors, you're going to have time to unlock your late game, and your late game is a perfectly serviceable and acceptable blood economy, or a diverse death or whatever economy you want to break into, supported by a whole bunch of really good tools like summonable super combatants and thugs, recruitable thugs, lots of stealthy raiding teams, which again are another great tool in terms of making people hate their life, and paths to really ratchet up pretty high in those elemental tiers, which unlocks the ability to boom your research and do a whole bunch of other cool stuff. So because of the array of tools that are available to the nation, because it's got some ability to move into the late game, but it's also got a nice little set of buffer and survival tools in the early and mid game, I do rate Nabar above average, although I acknowledge that if someone comes straight at you, rushing at you, using one of the powerhouses of this era, you might have a bit of trouble unless you can call someone else in, but that's the nature of diplomacy in this game. The weakness of the strongest nations in Dominions is that everyone knows that they're dangerous, and people will usually be willing to act to counter them, unless that person is working really overtime in order to keep the coalition off its back. I hope this has been helpful. This has been a long overdue video that was supported by my Patreon, so thank you very much for your patience during COVID and the Ukraine conflict and all of that. I hope that this has been useful and enjoyable, and that you're looking forward to more of this sort of content again soon, now that I'm starting to get my voice and my energy back after my time with COVID-19. Thanks all. Cheers.